Anyway, welcome, Mary. Thank you very much for coming, especially on these hot days. And I'll hand over to you now to carry on. Thank you.
Good evening to you all, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
My talk this evening is talking about my mother's ancestry. And it's also about a little mystery, which came to light when I inherited a locket after my mother died. Now, this presentation, I do taking the story backwards so that the process of the research can be followed. Now, for a group such as yourselves, with the amount of experience you all have in family history research, some of this you will be ahead of me, I'm sure, in some of the things. But this is a talk I've given to a lot of other groups where perhaps one or two people in the audience have got a little bit of experience. So I have to do some explaining as I go along. So look, while I'm delivering it to you, I'm going to be doing some quick editing to think, yeah, they know that. They don't need to be told all this. But as I say, the plan is to take the research going back in time. So the right thing to do now is to introduce you to my mother. She died suddenly, very peacefully, in 2009 at the age of 93. And as I was the only daughter of the family, all her personal possessions became mine. And these included this Victorian locket and chain. Worn, fragile. And although my mother Hilda knew whose it had been originally, she did not know whose was the tiny, pale face that had been so carefully preserved inside it. Mother's maiden name was Hilda May Batty. She was born in Wolverhampton in 1915. And she was nothing remotely like this other famous Batty. But Hilda knew that her father's family had come from Yorkshire. And I do remember that way back when Last of the Summer Wine was becoming very popular, the writer, Roy Clark, said that he'd asked the head teacher of the primary school at Holmfirth in Yorkshire, you may well recall, it was filmed at Holmfirth. He'd asked, what is the commonest surname on your school roll? He was told it was Batty, and so that's why he used it for one of his major characters. In fact, the name is widespread in this southern part of Yorkshire and is said to derive from a diminutive of the personal name Bartholomew, as in Bartholomew, Barty, Batty, and thus. Now, the neatest place to start talking about my Batty family is to show you this announcement, which appeared in the Wolverhampton Express and Star newspaper on the 23rd of March, 1960. Now, I was then 8, rising 9, and I well remember this occasion because the whole of my mother's immediate family gathered to celebrate the day at my grandparents' home in Wolverhampton. And they had a professional photographer come to record the occasion. So here we all are. So here are my grandparents, Harold and Lily. Behind them, my mum Hilda. This is my father and this is me. My mum's younger brother, Uncle Ken. My mum's elder brother, Uncle Jim. Their wives, their children. This is my big brother, the only grandson in the family, and the rest of my cousins. And so I can give you a very basic family tree chart. And I do remember that the family clubbed together to buy Grandma and Grandad a special gift to mark their anniversary. And the gift was an electric kettle. Well, 1960, That was cutting edge technology. This was an expensive luxury item. I even remember the kettle because after my grandparents were gone, came to our house. Grandma and Grandad Batty were my only grandparents in childhood, as my father's parents were both gone long before I was born. And here are Grandma and Grandad exactly as I remember them. The picture was taken at Llandudno in the 1950s. And you might recall, as I do, that back in those days, places like Llandudno, there would be one or two photographers in the street taking the pictures you go past, give you a card, you go to the shop next day, and if you like the look of the picture, you buy it. And that is exactly the background to that picture. They both died when I was in my early teens, Grandma in 1964, Grandad in 1966. And it wasn't until some 5 years after that that I first began looking into my family history. And then later, and first of all, I engaged with my father's family, the Bodfish side, then decided, well, let's have a go and see what I can find about the Battys. And of course, then I really regretted that I'd not been able to talk to them about their early lives. Although we visited my grandparents quite often at Wolverhampton, it wasn't the sort, how can I call it, the lovey-dovey, touchy-feely kind of relationship with those grandparents. But I know my grandfather, if I'd asked him, I'm sure he would have talked to me. He was an intelligent man. He was widely read. It meant that when I got going, I'd only got such information as my mother Hilda could recall. Now, for every single one of us, of course, your own family history starts with Mum and Dad. Here are my parents on their wedding day. They were married on the 24th of October at the little Methodist chapel in Shore Road, Bushbury, that Hilda had attended from childhood. The date, of course, not that long after the end of the Second World War, when you still had to give up coupons for clothes or material to make clothes. And Hilda was going to be 30 shortly after that, and she said, I'm too old for a full white wedding gown, which I'm sure was a disappointment to my grandmother because she had been a professional dressmaker and tailoress, and with only one daughter, I'm sure she dreamed of making her daughter's wedding gown. I'm pretty sure it was Lily who actually made Hilda's costume. Remember, back then and well into the 50s, ladies wore a costume. And I'm not sure what the colour was of Hilda's, but I do know that her hat, her gloves and shoes were navy blue, and she'd had to scour the shops in both Wolverhampton and Birmingham to try and find matching ones because, of course, there was so little available in the shops at the time. We're going to look at Hilda's life until her marriage. A birth certificate. 25th of November 1915, born at 88 Owen Road, Wolverhampton. And Harold's occupation then was a draper's assistant. In fact, he worked in a large drapery and haberdashery store named Waring's in Queen Square in Wolverhampton. And Lily didn't go out to work, but later on, she taught dressmaking classes in her own home. And here is Hilda with her younger brother Ken, standing outside 88 Owen Road. And here she is very much later when I took her back there one day so that she could see again where her early childhood years had been spent. Hilda was a bright little girl. She won a fee scholarship to go to one of the two grammar schools in Wolverhampton. She went to the Wolverhampton Municipal Secondary School, which besides, we might think of that in terms of it having been a secondary modern school, but that, in fact, it was a grammar school. And she enjoyed her school days very much. She won form prizes. She passed all the examinations to qualify at the age of 16 for the school certificate, for which I know you had to have English and maths and a foreign language and a science at the very least. Now, she had no ambitions to follow some of her friends into teaching, and indeed, Harold and Lily would not have been able to afford to keep Hilda during the years of her additional education and teaching qualification. So she left school at 16. But this was 1931, in the middle of the terrible years of depression. The situation made employment prospects pretty hopeless, even for a smart and well-qualified school leaver. And eventually she went to work at a newsagents and lending library shop in the Central Arcade in Wolverhampton. She had an early romance. She was engaged at the age of 18. Here she is, as a bridesmaid, when her elder brother, my Uncle Jim, married in 1940. And the man behind Hilda's right shoulder there was her fiancé. His name was Alfred Alsop. I think my grandmother Lily's outfit here with the fox fur is very stylish for the time. But the years went by and Alf never seemed to have any realistic ideas as to how they were to be able to get a home together. And in 1943, in the late 20s, Hilda realised that her feelings about Alf had changed, and she decided the right thing to do was to end that engagement. Earlier, in 1939, when Hilda realised that war with Germany was looming, and as she was unmarried and childless, she would certainly be liable for a call up for some kind of war work, and thinking, well, I could get directed into a munitions factory. Isn't there something I could get myself into? And when she saw an advertisement for volunteers to train for the auxiliary fire service, which would provide her with a job immediately on war being declared, she jumped at it. I realised as I grew older that for Hilda, the war years were the most challenging, stimulating and interesting of her life. And as a very elderly lady, she reminisced about this period constantly. See, working in the fire service had given her real responsibility for the first time in her life. And her intelligence and commitment brought promotion. She went on training courses. Here she is with a group photograph. That's Hilda, taken at the National Fire Service Training Centre in Sussex. Don't those girls look smart in their uniforms? And 1944, Hilda qualified to be a mobile instructor. And this meant that she had to plan and deliver training courses to firemen as well as firewomen in the West Bromwich, Oldbury and Smethwick area. She loved doing it, but it meant leaving the Wolverhampton fire station where she had previously worked. And she was directed to be based at Rolfe Street Fire Station in Smethwick. And she soon gained a reputation there for standing no nonsense, knowing her own mind. And when fireman Jim Bodfish encountered her, he thought, this one's got a bit about her. As the war progressed towards its end, it was known that all firewomen were going to be made redundant as soon as victory was finally declared. This was to open up employment spaces for the men who were going to be demobilised. So by May 1945, Hilda was at a crossroads in her life. She was going to be 30 years old that year, and she wanted a home of her own because her home really was still with her parents in Wolverhampton. And Jim Bodfish had become very special to her. And although he cared enough to give her his sweet ration, he hadn't spoken anything about his own feelings. But on the 4th of July that year, they were able to arrange that they'd got a day off on the same day. And they met up at New Street Station in Birmingham. They went on the train to Oxford and had a very pleasant day there. Then, on the way home, in the train, and I trust that it was one of those compartments where, you shut the door on everybody else, he proposed to her and was accepted. Jim was firmly of the view that a married woman, especially if she had young children, should not have to go out to work. And that's when Hilda gave up any thought of trying to continue her career. She knew that further on there would be some interesting opportunities, but no, that was going to be the end of her employment in that area. So on the 15th of August, Hilda was finally made redundant. But she needed to keep working until her wedding, coming up in October. And so the very next day, the 16th of August, she reported for work at the Central Naval Armament Depot in Wolverhampton. I did wonder how it came about that the Navy had an armament depot in Wolverhampton. You're about as far as you can get from a naval dockyard. But I suspect that it was because of the number of black country firms who were supplying the Royal Navy. I think it had that connection. So here we are back at Hilda's wedding day and their marriage certificate, which most of the details you already know. James Bodfish, 34, bachelor, fireman from Smethwick. His father's name and occupation there, Hilda, 29, clerk in the civil service for the Admiralty, living in Oxley, Wolverhampton, and her father's name you've encountered, Harold Norman Batty. He's now manager of that drapery shop in Wolverhampton. Now, going back, 40 plus years, do you remember how telegrams would be sent to congratulate the bride and groom, and the best man had to read them out at the reception? And Hilda kept the telegrams that she received. And this is addressed to Bodfish Povey's, that was the name of the restaurant where they were having their reception in Victoria Street. From Red Watch, Merrydale. Now, the rota system in the fire service is termed a watch, like the Navy. And they used to have red watch, white watch, and blue watch. But in more recent years, they also have green watch. Merrydale was the fire station she'd spent most of the years working at. So, for Batty, Bushbury, now known as Bodfish Smethwick, a coupling of two bright sparks, well alight. Stop. Happiness diffuser in use, no dampening down required. Time of operation, 1400 hours. Stop. Congratulations. Of course, that's the kind of terminology that the fire service women in the watchroom would have been very familiar with using. In the 1911 census, Harold and Lily were living in Wolverhampton in Lord Street with their one-year-old son, James, my Uncle Jim, and not long after that they moved to 88 Owen Road, where Hilda was born in 1915. Oh, doesn't she look a worried little soul in that photograph? In April 1916, the government passed a law making all men aged between 18 and 41 liable for call-up for military service to swell the ranks that were thinning because of the terrible war casualties. Single men were taken first, and then married men became liable, and eventually Harold's call-up came. And I think that this photograph was taken for him to take with him, because most unusually for a old family photograph, it's got the date of February 1918 on the back of it. The third child, Ken, my mother's younger brother, he was present, but you couldn't yet see him because he was born a few months later. So Harold was then in his early 30s, but when he went for his interview, he was graded as being C3 fit. A man has to be A1 fit to be sent for service on the front line. And Harold was graded C3 because he suffered from what you might call an industrial disease, in terms of people have to spend a lot of their working life on their feet. He got varicose veins. So he was sent to work as a clerk in the Royal Flying Corps. That was, of course, the forerunner of the Royal Air Force. And very luckily for Harold, his job at Waring's was kept open. So when he was demobbed, I don't know what the date was, but he was able to return to work there. And it kept him in work through those terrible Depression years of the late 1920s and 30s. Not at all a well-paid job for a man with 3 children, but at least he was employed. So I now want to investigate Harold's earlier life. He was born on the 29th of June, 1885 at Mexborough in Yorkshire. Now, that is a very old photocopy of his birth certificate. So here we have his father's name, William Batty, and his mother's name, Emily Elizabeth Batty, formerly Souter. And not entirely surprisingly, William Batty was also a draper, and Harold was born, as I say, High Street, Mexborough. There is High Street, Mexborough. That was picture was taken about 20 years later than when Harold was actually born there, but it probably looked very similar 20 years earlier. So one of these shops somewhere along here was Batty's drapery establishment. It did take me quite a long time, actually, to get through the census returns for the Batty family, because I'm sure you'll have encountered this yourselves. The transcripts of a number of these returns were not in the least accurate. But I can sympathise when the transcriber is met with something that looks like that. That's the 1891 census, and that is the transcript in which the family name has been transcribed as Bathing. So that's why I didn't find it when I was first searching, but eventually, when they say, you'll know the kind of dogged hard work it takes, I did come across them. My mother remembered her grandfather, William Batty, well. She said he had a deep, resonant voice and a strong Yorkshire accent. She said he was known to be a free thinker, a staunch Methodist, and a firm supporter of the Liberal Party. And although she knew very little about them, Hilda knew that Harold had an elder sister and 2 brothers, known as Billy and Horace. She'd also heard the names Clarence and Edgar mentioned, but she'd no idea who they were. But that is a basic family tree I was able to put together for that generation. There you see Harold is the eldest of the 3 sons. Well, the drapery business in Mexborough seems to have prospered. And in 1892, and I can give the date because I found a newspaper notice in the local paper someone saying that he'd bought up William Batty's stock in 1892, and William moved the family 40 miles or so north to the town of Keighley, a noticeably bigger place than Mexborough. And the family lived there at 27 Devonshire Street, conveniently near to William's drapery shop at numbers 44 to 46 in Low Street. Now, this picture is indeed very much of the period when Batty's drapery shop was there. Low Street vanished 30 odd years ago under a redeveloped shopping centre. Then came a period when the Batty drapery business began to struggle. I've traced it in the trade directories between 1893 and 1904 for Keighley. But at the time of the Boer War, which took place between 1899 and 1903, Freethinker William Batty was not convinced of the rightness of Britain's policy in pursuing this South African war. That was indeed the view of a number of the leading Liberal politicians. And as there were numerous other drapers' shops to choose from in Keighley, it seems the ladies were saying, "Oh, we'll not go to Mr. Batty's, he's a pro-Boer." And then the Co-op opened a shop in Low Street selling drapery lines. Batty's simply couldn't compete with them, and at some point around 1904, the family business failed. What were they to do? The decision was made they would up sticks, they would move south to Derby, because that's where Emily Elizabeth Souter had come from, and she still had family connections there. Yorkshire was left behind, and so was the daughter of the family, Rosa May. She'd married there, so there she stayed. William found work as a commercial traveller, probably, I would think, selling drapery and haberdashery lines. And Billy and Horace both became clerks. And Harold, by now aged around 20, had been working in his father's drapery business. He got, sound experience, and he was able to get a job in the drapery department of Ranby's, the largest department store in Derby. And again, that picture is very much of the period when Harold first worked there. This establishment here is Ranby's. And the family started to attend the Green Hill Methodist Chapel in the centre of Derby.